wayekhona umkhosana okwayibabamkhulu wawubaba okwathi uma isibambene lapha noma ngeke ngisho exactly ukuthi kwakuyiphi indawo lapha yathi uma isima laphana wayidonsa ukuthi ayingene ngaphakathi ikwenzela bebaqothe baqede phela ilapho umkhosana efike wafela khona.
The Zulus moved forward, the horns closed. Faced with the full weight of the Zulu force, the British line broke. There are stories of men running out of ammunition, stories of guns jamming, stories of native contingents running away. But as the Zulus advanced, the British line broke. Chingwayo, the Zulu general, from a vantage point up on the ridge, watched his plan work. This was his finest hour.
This was an enormous battle. This battle had its moment when it might even have been a British victory. But all those things that make good soldiery came into play. Good tactics, good men, use of the ground, mobility, communication. And the British were short on many of those. And the Zulus were long on many of those. And the Zulus carried the day. I'm convinced that we have to appraise this battle accordingly. We have to stop looking at it as a British defeat and disaster. Overwhelming numbers of savages coming over the hills, darkening the azure skies with clouds of assegais. Go and read the poetry of this period. Forget it. These were brave, intelligent human beings under intelligent command, executing brilliantly issued commands brilliantly. And they carried it off in 2 hours. All over. Modern British Army. Finished.
The ordinary soldiers had no chance. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. In groups and alone, they fell. When reports of shooting being heard in the camp reached Lord Chelmsford, they were airily dismissed. "How amusing," said one of his officers. And then, in the final moments of the battle, the skies darkened. There was an eclipse. Several hours later, Chelmsford returned. He found mostly bodies to greet him. 1,300 of his men had been killed.
Most of the men who fought this battle were in fact trapped by the idiocy and the arrogance of their officers, unable to go anywhere else, and were caught, isolated, without horses to get away like so many of the officers, and were slaughtered here. That's something that's forgotten. It's somehow this devoted band against this mountain. I think it's much more tragic than that.
Chelmsford's failure to recognize the ability of his enemy had cost his men dearly.
This is something that plagues the European armies for a very long time indeed, and it is a very great mistake, because what those people who think that way don't understand is it doesn't actually matter where you come from or what colour you are. What actually matters is how well trained you are and how well led you are. That's all that matters.
In Britain, Isandlwana was seen as an aberration. No lesson was learned. Even in the next century, British armies and British officers were still paying the price for underestimating their enemies. In 1942, General Arthur Percival was about to oversee one of the greatest British defeats of modern times. Percival misled himself about the strength and intentions of his enemy, and in doing so, took away his men's will to fight. Before the war, Singapore was Britain's stronghold in the Far East. In the 30s, Britain had turned the island into a giant fortress, a huge naval base defended by enormous guns pointing in the direction from which everyone assumed the enemy would come, the sea.
Well, you know, all along we were told that Singapore would never fall. It's the pride of the British Empire, you know. There you have all the big guns, you know, facing the sea. And if enemies were to come from the sea, well, they had no chance of taking Singapore. We thought Singapore would never fall, such a strong fortress.
British confidence reigned supreme. They even knew who the enemy would be, but saw no real threat.
The Japanese were regarded as little men with short-sighted, scared of heights, inability to control machinery, people who brought very poor bits of machinery in with them, which was of course all psychological nonsense, and they believed it all.
Japan's invasion of China in 1937 should have been a warning, but the belief in British superiority persisted.
They know from observers watching the Japanese in the war in China that they're very hardy, frugal soldiers who may be okay, behaved in a very brutal way, but they were highly efficient as well. But like so often happens, and I can quote other examples, people look at the intelligence and don't actually believe what they're seeing because it doesn't suit them. And again, this comes back to the business of underestimating the enemy.
It's often assumed that the Japanese invasion tactics took the British completely by surprise. It's certainly true that all those seaward-pointing guns turned out to be pointing the wrong way, but in fact, it had been known for years that plans for the defense of Singapore were hopelessly wrong. For most of its history, it had been impossible for an invader to approach Singapore except by sea. To the north was Malaya, a country covered by impenetrable jungle, forming a natural defensive barrier to the island. But Malaya had developed as a major supplier of the world's rubber. Now roads crisscrossed the forests, providing access for businessmen, traders, and invaders.
Road networks were built, the railway was expanded, jungle was cleared for rubber plantation, and by the middle to late 1930s, it did become possible to think of an invader moving through Malaya down towards Singapore.
In 1937, the British even commissioned a report that predicted exactly how the Japanese would invade. But the government, reluctant to spend money, still convinced the Japanese posed no threat, did nothing. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival was the army commander in Singapore. He had been a staff officer in the 30s and had played a major part in writing the 1937 report. But he believed he could do nothing to force the government to act.
You would have thought that Percival would have immediately started to kick up a tremendous fuss about how he couldn't hope to defend Malaya and Singapore with such an understrength army. But Percival was, the only term I can use, a true company man. And he tried to do what he thought was the best he could with what he had.
I think Percival was too weak as a leader. He'd been a very brave battalion commander in the First World War, but that, I think, was about his level. He was also actually quite intolerant. He was intolerant of some of the people he commanded because they hadn't been to staff college. He was, in a way, a sort of mixture of a military snob and a guy who actually is a bit weak when it comes to moral things.
Brigadier Simpson, the chief engineer, urged, pleaded, begged Percival to go ahead with a program of fortifications and fixed defenses. On both occasions, Percival either rejected outright or hesitated fatally on the grounds that building defenses would be bad for morale, and it might encourage in the troops a kind of sit on your butt in the trench and do not go out and fight the enemy mentality. There was simply no meeting of the minds between Simpson and Percival, and this turned out to be tragic because Simpson got it exactly right.
I think you've got to be honest with your troops and say this is the threat and this is how we're going to go about beating them, because if you don't, if you downplay and then these people turn out to be exceedingly efficient and exceedingly dangerous and formidable, the effect on the morale of your own troops, having been told, well, you know, these guys aren't a problem, and suddenly they are, is pretty shattering.
On the 8th of December 1941, in the early hours of the morning, the Japanese launched their invasion.
Everything goes right for the Japanese, everything goes wrong for the British, and the key to it for both is speed. The Japanese destroy all the basic defense plans for Malaya in 4 days, in 100 hours.
200 miles away in Singapore, amazingly, there was little alarm.
All the lights were on in Singapore. All the dances were going on just the same. It carried on like that. Christmas was the best Christmas we ever had. By then, they got these silhouettes of German soldiers. So all the shooting stars had got German soldiers on. And while the lads up in Malaya were shooting for their lives, we were shooting for fun. We was on Singapore.
Social life was going on as the Japanese were advancing down the peninsula. Parties were still being held in the Raffles Hotel. The messes were full. It was a kind of blind belief that the Japanese were going to be somehow easily turned back at some point down the Malayan Peninsula and that they really wouldn't have to worry in Singapore.
But Churchill was worried. He sent out 2 battleships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, but within days of their arrival, the Japanese had sunk both of them. The Air Force was practically decimated and the entire defense force on the run. General Wavell, the new commander of the Pacific, chose this moment to visit Percival.
General Wavell put to him directly and bluntly the question, why haven't you done anything about this? And Percival replied, I was afraid this would suggest to the civilians that we wouldn't be able to hold out up country. It would be bad for their morale. Wavell, and you can understand his frustration, said acidly, it's going to be a hell of a lot worse for their morale when Japanese troops start pouring across the causeway and along an undefended coast.
As the Japanese neared the island, the bombing raids intensified. Finally, the dances at the Raffles Hotel came to an end.
A great pall of black smoke hangs over the island. Bodies are lying in the streets. The hospitals are overrun with injured from the bombings and also from the fighting in the north. The Japanese then start dropping incendiary bombs. One of them hits an Indian hospital. 700 people burnt to death in that hospital. And it gets really beyond all control. And once the water gives out, Percival's will to stand and fight has simply been crippled.
Percival ordered his troops back off the causeway onto the island to sit and wait for the Japanese to arrive.
What happened here in Singapore was, for the British Empire and its armies, nothing new. They'd seen it before. It had happened at Bunker Hill in Boston. It had happened at Isandlwana in southern Africa. British Empire armies paid a terrible price for not taking seriously enough an enemy which didn't look like them, dress like them, act like them, fight like them. The disaster that began at Bunker Hill marked the end of Britain's first empire. The disaster that reached its climax here in Singapore, in the long run, marked the end of its last.
As the Japanese pounded the island, British morale plummeted. Furious at the lack of defense preparations, many soldiers had lost the will to fight. By the time the Japanese set foot on Singapore, Percival had effectively beaten his own army.
Percival's army literally disintegrated in his hands as the troops concluded, having been disappointed time and again, that their higher commanders simply did not know what they were doing, were not giving them any chance to put up any sort of a meaningful fight, and took matters into their own